You are a priest, standing in the cold, echoing halls of Westminster Abbey. It's the autumn of 1396, and your breath mists in the chill air as you clutch your prayer book, watching nervously as servants bustle about, preparing for what many whisper will be the strangest royal wedding England has ever seen. The bride has arrived from France, a princess, they say, the daughter of King Charles VI himself. You've officiated many noble weddings in your time, witnessed countless hands joined beneath these ancient arches, but never anything like this. When the great oak doors swing open and the procession begins, you are struck speechless. The groom, King Richard II, cuts an imposing figure at 29, tall and regal, his golden hair glowing in the stained glass light. But beside him walks a child, her head barely reaching his waist. Her tiny hand is swallowed in his gloved palm. She can't be older than 6 or 7. Dressed in an elaborate French gown, her dark hair braided with pearls too heavy for her small frame, she looks like she belongs in a nursery, not a coronation. You lean slightly against the altar rail for support. This is Isabella of Valois, and today she becomes Queen of England. In your time, you've seen brides as young as 12 or 13, it's not unheard of. Political alliances often trump age or sentiment. After all, you live in a world shaped by plague and uncertainty, where peace can be shattered in an instant and kings must act swiftly. Marriage, no matter how unconventional, often cements treaties more firmly than words ever could. As the ceremony begins, you study the child's face. She looks more curious than afraid, her wide eyes roaming the towering arches, the flickering candles, the assembled nobles in their finest velvet and brocade. When Richard speaks his vows, his tone is gentle, almost protective. This is not a man exploiting a child for pleasure. This is a king performing his duty, forging peace with France through a sacred, symbolic union. Everyone knows the marriage will not be consummated. Isabella will be raised and educated in England until she comes of age. That's the custom. You bless their union with a steady voice, but as you pronounce them husband and wife, a strange unease grips your heart. Watching that little girl take her place as Queen of England, you cannot help but wonder what fate awaits her in the treacherous game of royal politics. To understand what brought a 6-year-old girl to the altar with a 29-year-old king, we have to step back and look at the world Isabella of Valois was born into, a world defined by war, instability, and fragile diplomacy. Isabella was born on November 9, 1389, in the Louvre Palace in Paris, the eldest daughter of one of Europe's most troubled monarchs, Charles VI of France, a king remembered by history not for his victories, but for his madness. At times, Charles was a capable and charismatic ruler. But when his illness took hold, he became unrecognizable, forgetting his name, claiming he was made of glass, even refusing to bathe or change clothes for months at a time. One moment, he might cradle young Isabella in his lap, laughing and telling her stories. The next, he might be found screaming in a corner, convinced assassins were coming, or standing frozen for hours, afraid that a single movement would shatter his imagined glass body. Servants would hurry the royal children away when these episodes struck, but the fear remained, etched into Isabella's young eyes. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was no less formidable, a beautiful and intelligent woman who, in the absence of her husband's sanity, took control of the royal court. She understood politics, perhaps too well, and she saw early on that her daughter, with her royal blood and striking appearance, could be a valuable pawn in the dangerous chessboard of European diplomacy. France, during Isabella's childhood, was a kingdom on the edge. The 100 Years' War with England had been raging for decades, devastating villages, draining treasuries, and leaving entire regions in ruin. By the 1390s, both France and England were exhausted. England's coffers were nearly empty. French farmers lived under constant threat of raids. Peace seemed desperately needed, but peace, in the medieval world, required more than words. It needed blood ties. Bonds that could not be broken by the whims of politics. That's where Isabella came in. In 1395, just 1 year after the death of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, King Richard II of England received a proposal: marry the young French princess and in return, receive an immense dowry and, More importantly, a 28-year truce with France. Richard had been devastated by Anne's death. Their marriage, unusually for the time, had been one of affection, even love. Her passing left him grief-stricken and childless, a dangerous position for any king. At first, he resisted the idea of remarriage. No one could replace Anne. But duty has a way of breaking through sorrow, and the offer from France was tempting. An enormous dowry of 800,000 francs. Nearly 3 decades of peace. The chance to stabilize his kingdom and outmaneuver rebellious nobles. There was only one complication: Isabella was 6 years old. Even by the standards of medieval royal marriages, this was young. Political brides were often adolescents, not children. But the French argued that this was exactly the point. Isabella's youth symbolized a fresh start. She would be raised at the English court, molded by English customs, loyal to the English crown. By the time she came of age, she would be more English than French. Richard's court was divided. Some saw a strategic masterstroke: money, peace, and influence, all through a single marriage. Others feared the optics: a grown man marrying a child, even in a symbolic union. But when Richard saw the tiny portrait of Isabella sent by French envoys, something softened in him. Perhaps he saw not a bride, but a daughter. A child in need of care, protection, and purpose. And perhaps, having lost his own wife, Richard saw in this little girl not only the promise of peace, but a second chance at family. The negotiations for the marriage of Isabella and Richard were long, complex, and filled with the kind of detail that only the medieval world could demand. For months, ambassadors shuttled back and forth across the Channel, haggling over everything, from Isabella's dowry and attendance to the exact wording that would ensure the marriage remained unconsummated until she reached maturity. The French insisted on certain protections. Isabella would keep her French ladies-in-waiting, be allowed to observe French customs, and continue corresponding with her family. In return, England would gain not just a queen-in-waiting, but a symbol of peace, of unity, and of hope. All the while, the child herself remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around her name. In Paris, 6-year-old Isabella played with dolls and practiced English phrases with her tutors, occasionally told that she would soon travel to a faraway land to meet a king. She had no idea what it meant to become a queen. To her, this was little different from the fairy tales her nurses whispered at bedtime. On October 31st, 1396, the first wedding ceremony took place at the port city of Calais, an English stronghold on French soil, carefully chosen as neutral ground. Isabella, now 7, was so small that she had to be helped down the aisle in her gown of gold-threaded silk, its weight too much for her tiny frame. Witnesses remembered how Richard knelt down to her level to place the ring on her finger, how gently he lifted her chin to reassure her as nobles from both kingdoms watched in silence. It was a quiet, political affair. But a year later, England gave Isabella the coronation of a queen. On a cold London morning, Westminster Abbey was packed to capacity. Some even died in the crush to glimpse the famous child bride. She processed through the streets in a litter draped with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, her crown specially made to fit her small head, her train carried by English duchesses appointed to guide and raise her. At just 8 years old, Isabella was now officially Queen of England. The celebrations that followed stretched for days: banquets, pageants, music, and theatrical displays promising prosperity and peace through this improbable union. At the coronation feast, she sat beside Richard at the high table, politely picking at her food while English lords toasted her health and the alliance she now represented. But beneath the grandeur, whispers of unease stirred in the corners of the court. Peace, even one sealed by royal marriage, was fragile. Richard was not beloved by all. There were murmurs about his reliance on favorites, his uneasy relationships with powerful nobles, his willingness to compromise with France. But for now, with Isabella safely installed in her royal apartments at Westminster Palace, it seemed England had found a measure of calm. The little queen, protected by her attendants and taught in both French and English, began the long, delicate process of becoming more than a symbol, of growing into a life she had never chosen. At Westminster, Isabella's new life began in earnest. Though still a child, she was now at the heart of English power, a living emblem of peace between two kingdoms long at war. Her days were structured and filled, lessons in English and Latin, embroidery, music, court etiquette, and the intricate rules of royal behavior. She was surrounded by a carefully selected household that blended English tutors with French attendants, creating a world where two cultures quietly negotiated through her education. Richard, to the surprise of many, took a personal interest in her upbringing. He visited her regularly, bringing exotic gifts from across his realm, painted manuscripts from Oxford, carved toys from London's finest craftsmen, even birds from Ireland. He seemed to find comfort in her presence, treating her not as a political asset, but as someone to protect and nurture. In return, Isabella began to greet him with a curious blend of respect and affection, somewhere between student and daughter. The other noble children at court quickly became her companions, and she formed a particular bond with Margaret Holland, the daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was only a little older than Isabella but already savvy to the unspoken rules of English politics. It was Margaret who taught her children's games in English, who whispered the names of allies and enemies, and who explained that silence and smiles could sometimes be more powerful than words. Together they roamed the palace gardens, practiced needlework under the watchful eyes of the duchesses, and exchanged secrets that no royal tutor could teach. But even as Isabella adapted to her new life, she began to sense the tension that rippled beneath the surface of court life. Nobles would grow quiet when Richard entered a room. Courtiers would pause mid-conversation when she approached. Her French attendants, once open and talkative, now chose their words more carefully. One day, she asked Margaret why the English nobles seemed to watch each other so closely. In France, she said, people fought and schemed, but here, it felt like everyone was waiting for something. Margaret, wise beyond her years, gave a grim little smile. Because Richard has enemies, she explained. He's powerful now, but power here must be shared. And not everyone agrees with the way he rules. It was then that Isabella began to understand the true nature of the world she had entered. Her marriage wasn't just about peace. It was also about politics, ambition, and survival. She was more than a child bride. She was a living treaty, a diplomatic shield, and perhaps, one day, a bargaining chip. But for the moment, Richard's court remained intact. And in the safety of her private chambers, under the carved ceilings of Westminster, Isabella continued to grow, her English sharper, her manners refined, and her eyes slowly opening to the treacherous world of royal power. The calm that had settled over Isabella's world would not last. By early 1399, when she was just 9 years old, the mood at court began to shift. Conversations quieted more abruptly when she entered a room. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged tense glances behind her back. Even Margaret Holland, usually so composed, seemed distracted and uneasy. Richard himself changed. His visits became infrequent, and when he did appear, he seemed distant, gazing out the windows toward the Thames, saying little, lost in thought. The thoughtful, gentle king who once brought her books and birds now carried the weight of something darker. At first, Isabella wondered if she had done something wrong. But the truth was far more serious. Richard was facing the gravest crisis of his reign. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whom he had exiled, had returned to England, not just to reclaim lost lands, but with an army and a claim to the throne. Nobles, long resentful of Richard's rule, quickly began defecting. Isabella's carefully constructed life, the palace routines and quiet confidence of her royal role, was about to collapse. One morning, she awoke to find that several of her English attendants had vanished overnight. When she asked where they had gone, no one would give her a clear answer. That evening, from her chamber windows, she saw soldiers in unfamiliar livery entering the courtyard. Then Margaret burst into her rooms, breathless and pale. "We're leaving Westminster," she whispered. "Tonight. Only take what's necessary. The king says it's for your safety." Isabella's heart pounded. "Where are we going?" she asked. Margaret hesitated. "The Tower." Those words hit like a cold wind. Isabella knew what the Tower of London was, not just a royal residence, but a place of imprisonment. A place people were sent when the kingdom was no longer safe. That night, under heavy guard, she was taken through the dark streets in a closed litter. No cheering crowds. No processions. Only the distant sounds of unrest. The tower, when they reached it, was comfortable, but clearly meant to confine. The windows were barred. Guards stood at every entrance. Her English attendants were dismissed. For the first time since coming to England, Isabella felt not like a queen, but a prisoner. Richard came to see her 2 days later, and he looked like a man unrecognizable. His once pristine robes were creased, his hair unkempt, his face drawn. He knelt before her, just as he had on the day of their wedding, but this time, there was no celebration, only sorrow. "My dear child," he said gently, "there are those who challenge my right to rule. I may not be able to protect you much longer." Isabella looked at him, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "Are you still king?" Richard smiled bitterly. "For now," he said. What followed was a conversation unlike any they had ever had. For the first time, Richard spoke to her not as a child, but as a political figure, explaining that Henry had returned, that many lords had abandoned him, and that England stood on the brink of revolution. "What will happen to me?" Isabella asked. Richard could only shake his head. "I don't know." And in that moment, she understood something that most adults never fully grasp. She was no longer just a girl. She was a symbol. A piece in the game. A child queen whose fate now depended not on love, nor duty, but on power, and the men who were about to seize it. The end came quickly. Within weeks, Richard was captured and forced to abdicate, and his cousin Henry Bolingbroke crowned himself King Henry IV. Isabella, still confined within the tower, watched the world change around her, watched guards change uniforms, heard names whispered with fear or contempt, and waited in silence, not knowing what future awaited her. Then, one gray October morning, the heavy doors to her chamber creaked open, and in walked the man himself, Henry, now king. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed not in the flowing finery Richard favored, but in the dark, practical garments of a man used to war. He studied her carefully, this small, poised girl who had once been Queen of England. "Your Grace," he said, using her title with studied formality, "I regret that we must meet under these circumstances." Isabella stood, curtsied as she had been taught, and met his gaze without flinching. "What has become of the king?" she asked. Henry did not hesitate. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king. He has surrendered the crown." The words were carefully chosen, polished, political, but Isabella understood. Richard hadn't given up the throne willingly. He had been forced to. She said nothing, only asked the one question that now mattered most: "What becomes of me?" Henry's answer was cold and uncertain. "That depends on many things: your father's response, the advice of my counselors, and your own conduct." From that moment, Isabella understood the truth. She was no longer a queen, not truly. She was a hostage in a new regime, a diplomatic problem to be managed or leveraged. Yet she refused to act the part of a defeated child. In the weeks that followed, she walked the thin line between dignity and submission. She was never defiant, but she never begged. She was unfailingly polite to her new guardians, careful never to insult or provoke. At the same time, she insisted on being addressed with the title she still legally held, and leaned on the support of her French ladies-in-waiting, women who remained fiercely loyal and who reminded her, again and again, that in the eyes of France, she was still a queen. Meanwhile, the world outside whispered of Richard's fate. First came rumors that he had died in prison. Then darker stories, that he had been murdered, quietly, in the cold isolation of Pontefract Castle. When confirmation finally reached Isabella, she wept, not as a widow in mourning for a husband she loved, but as a girl grieving the only protector she had known in a foreign land. Richard had never been cruel to her. In truth, he had been kind, even gentle. Whatever the nature of their marriage, he had shielded her from the worst realities of power. Now, he was gone. And with him, any illusion of safety. Not long after, Henry's government issued an ultimatum. Isabella would be allowed to return to France, but only if she publicly recognized Henry as king and renounced any claim to the English throne as Richard's widow. It was a clever maneuver. Her compliance would legitimize Henry's rule and dissolve the last threads of the peace treaty with France. Isabella, now 10 years old, faced a brutal choice: accept exile and admit that her years as queen had meant nothing, or refuse and risk indefinite imprisonment. Her French advisors were divided. Some urged her to return and protect herself. Others insisted she had a duty to Richard's memory. But in the end, it was her father, King Charles VI of France, who, during one of his rare lucid moments, demanded she come home. Faced with the threat of renewed war, Henry's court agreed. The terms of her release were kept deliberately vague, neither side willing to admit defeat. And so, in the summer of 1401, Isabella of Valois left England, no longer queen, no longer child, returning to a homeland that had become a memory, carrying with her the weight of a life shaped by politics, loss, and the strange, fragile burden of being a girl used as a bridge between two warring kingdoms. When Isabella stepped off the ship and set foot on French soil once more, she was no longer the giggling child who had left 5 years earlier. At 11 years old, she was quiet, composed, and visibly older than her years. But the France she returned to was just as fractured and unstable as the England she had left behind. Her father, King Charles VI, was once again lost in madness, unaware, at first, that his daughter had even returned. In one of his delusional episodes, he failed to recognize her, whispering to courtiers that he was being hunted by invisible enemies. Her mother, Queen Isabella, greeted her with a mixture of relief and calculation. She embraced her daughter, kissed her cheeks, and then, almost immediately, began to weigh the political possibilities Isabella's return offered. Isabella was, after all, no ordinary girl. She had been Queen of England, however briefly, and that made her valuable. Her knowledge of English court customs, her ability to speak the language fluently, her insight into English politics, all of this made her an asset in the chess game of European diplomacy. French courtiers circled her like birds of prey, eager to discover how she could be used to strengthen alliances or destabilize England's fragile new regime. But Isabella herself had changed. The uncertain little girl had grown into a young woman who understood how power worked. When asked about Henry IV, she answered with care. When pressed for information about English nobles, she offered nothing more than polite generalities. She remembered too well how quickly trust could be turned into betrayal. Yet for all her caution, she found herself emotionally unmoored. France was her birthplace, but it no longer felt like home. She spoke French with a trace of an English accent. She preferred English fashions, English music, even English table manners. Her memories were not of Parisian gardens or French royal halls, but of Westminster, of the Tower, of long afternoons with Margaret Holland and the quiet presence of Richard, reading to her by candlelight. That version of her life was now gone, and she had returned not to innocence, but to a court of intrigue and growing chaos. Her father's illness had left France in the hands of rival noble factions, each vying for control of the kingdom. Queen Isabella herself, once her daughter's protector, had become a shrewd and distant strategist. For Isabella, survival once again meant adaptation. She kept her head down, followed the routines set for her, and quietly wondered what would become of her now. She was no longer a queen, but not yet a woman. No longer a child, but not truly free. She was a girl without a crown, without a home, and without a clear future, yet still watched by all of Europe, waiting to see what role she would play next. By the time Isabella turned 13, whispers of a second marriage began to circulate through the French court. Suitors emerged, some powerful, some ambitious, all aware of the political weight her name still carried. But one stood above the rest: Charles, Duke of Orléans. He was her cousin, the son of the king's brother, and at 29, he was the same age Richard II had been when he married her. Yet this time, things were different. Charles was not a distant foreign monarch looking to secure a treaty. He was a cultured, thoughtful man who had grown up amid the refined courts of France. He was a poet, a patron of the arts, and, unlike most noblemen, he sought a wife who could be an equal, not merely a consort. Their families approved. Politically, the match made sense. It kept Isabella within the royal family, prevented her from becoming a pawn in foreign affairs, and aligned her with one of the most powerful houses in France. But beyond strategy, something more human began to emerge. Charles had met Isabella several times in her childhood and had always shown her kindness. Now, as a young woman on the brink of adulthood, she found herself drawn to his quiet confidence and the intensity with which he listened when she spoke. He didn't treat her as a fragile relic of a failed alliance. He saw her for who she was, a survivor, an intelligent young woman who had endured more than most could imagine. During one of their private conversations, Charles said, "I'm not marrying the Queen of England. I'm marrying Isabella of Valois, the girl who returned from exile with her pride intact." And for the first time in her life, Isabella believed that someone truly saw her. The wedding was held in June 1406, at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. It was everything her first marriage had not been: grand, joyful, and centered around her. She was 16 years old, wearing a deep blue gown embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, her dark hair crowned with sapphires and pearls. She walked the aisle with measured grace, not as a child led by handlers, but as a young woman who understood exactly what she was walking toward. Charles waited at the altar with an expression not of triumph, but of hope. When they exchanged vows, they looked into each other's eyes, not because a treaty required it, but because they wanted to. The celebration that followed was a reflection of the vibrant court Charles had cultivated. Troubadours sang ballads written in their honor. Scholars recited verses praising wisdom, endurance, and love. The air was filled with music, laughter, and the quiet sense that something rare was happening, a royal marriage not built on necessity, but on mutual respect. For Isabella, it was the first time in her life she truly felt like she belonged, not as a symbol, not as a sacrifice, but as herself. The girl who had once been a political offering was now a duchess, a partner, and, finally, someone whose story was her own to write. The early years of Isabella's marriage to Charles of Orléans were the happiest of her life. At last, she had found not just safety, but partnership, real companionship built on trust, shared values, and a mutual love of beauty, intellect, and art. Charles, already known across France for his poetry and refinement, welcomed her into his court at Blois, transforming it into one of the most vibrant cultural centers in Europe. Together, they surrounded themselves with scholars, artists, and musicians. Isabella, no longer a passive royal figure, became an active patroness of the arts, commissioning illuminated manuscripts, sponsoring poets, and establishing a scriptorium where monks preserved classical and religious texts. But her influence extended beyond culture. Isabella brought with her not only the memories of England's court but the political awareness forged through years of quiet observation and survival. Charles respected her judgment and often consulted her on matters of governance and diplomacy. She was no longer a girl being instructed, she had become a partner in rule. In 1407, Isabella gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Jean. Motherhood transformed her. She was determined to give her daughter the emotional warmth and security she herself had been denied. Against the customs of high nobility, Isabella chose to nurse Jean herself, refusing to hand her over entirely to wet nurses. She watched over the baby's crib like a sentry, whispered lullabies in both French and English, and made silent promises that this child would grow up loved, not bartered away for treaties. Charles, for his part, was a devoted father, often found in the nursery reading or simply watching his daughter sleep. For a brief moment, the horrors of Isabella's past seemed far away. But the wider world was closing in. France was unraveling. Her father-in-law, Louis of Orléans, had risen to power during King Charles VI's bouts of madness, claiming the right to govern in the king's name. But this claim was challenged by the Duke of Burgundy, igniting a deadly rivalry between the Orleanist and Burgundian factions. Isabella tried to remain above it all, focusing on her family and court. But neutrality was a luxury she could no longer afford. In November 1407, her father-in-law was assassinated in broad daylight in Paris. The streets that had once welcomed her back to France now ran red with blood. The murder changed everything. Charles inherited his father's title, wealth, and political responsibilities, but also his enemies. The Burgundians had declared war in all but name, and Isabella's world became one of constant vigilance. Guards patrolled their home. Letters were screened. Her movements were watched. And Charles, once gentle and idealistic, hardened under the weight of vengeance and civil war. Isabella stood beside him, not only as a wife but as a political ally. Her time in England had taught her the price of naivety. She now understood power not as something bestowed by crowns, but as something protected, negotiated, and constantly under threat. Yet even as the shadows deepened, she held fast to the fragile joy she had built, the daughter in her arms, the books on her shelves, the man at her side who, in spite of the chaos, still looked at her with love. In the midst of rising conflict, Isabella gave birth to her second child in 1408, a son, Charles, named after both his father and grandfather. His arrival brought joy and renewed purpose, but it also marked the beginning of a slow and irreversible toll on Isabella's health. Childbirth, even under the best circumstances, was perilous in the medieval world, and Isabella's body was still recovering from her first pregnancy. Yet despite the exhaustion, she threw herself into motherhood with fierce devotion. She oversaw her son's care personally, choosing his tutors, inspecting his nursery, and planning his education with the mind of someone who knew too well how dangerous politics could be. She was determined that he would not just be noble in title, but wise in judgment, tempered by experience and compassion. Meanwhile, the civil war between the Orleanists and Burgundians grew increasingly violent. France, already weakened by decades of war with England and the instability of King Charles VI's reign, was sliding into chaos. Armies marched across once prosperous regions, burning villages and seizing lands. Isabella, now Duchess of Orléans in all but name, was often left to manage their estates while Charles rode off to command troops and defend their family's honor. In his absence, she handled everything from taxes to supply routes, using her sharp mind and quiet authority to hold their world together. Her leadership during these years surprised even her critics. She was no longer just the former child queen of England, she was a duchess in full command of her responsibilities. Yet every success came with a cost. Isabella's health, already fragile, began to falter. Chronic fatigue crept into her days. Her breathing grew shallow, her color paler, her strength harder to summon. Then, in 1409, she gave birth to a third child, a daughter named Marguerite. The delivery was long and harrowing. Complications nearly claimed Isabella's life, and for days afterward, she lay between worlds, feverish and drifting, as Charles and their physicians hovered helplessly nearby. She survived, but she was never the same. The birth had weakened her permanently. She moved more slowly, tired more easily, and was increasingly prone to illness. Her physicians warned that another pregnancy would almost certainly be fatal. It was a quiet, unspoken sorrow that settled between her and Charles. Their once passionate bond was now clouded by fear, not of each other, but of what love might cost. Still, their partnership endured. Isabella, though physically diminished, remained intellectually sharp. She continued to advise Charles, host scholars and diplomats, and raise their children with meticulous care. She instructed them in languages, in politics, in history, and in kindness. Every lesson she taught was shaped by her own past, the courtly games of England, the betrayal of kings, the fragility of power. She told them stories not to frighten, but to prepare. And even in her weakened state, she remained the center of her household, the calm at the heart of a storm she could no longer keep at bay. As France plunged deeper into internal war, Isabella knew her time was growing short. But she refused to retreat into bitterness or despair. Instead, she poured what strength she had left into ensuring that her children, and her legacy, would outlive the world that had asked so much of her. By 1410, Isabella's health had declined to the point where every winter brought new danger, and every fever felt like a final warning. Yet even as her body failed her, her mind remained sharp, and her influence endured. France was in the grip of full-blown civil war. The Duke of Burgundy had begun courting England for support, threatening to reignite the long-dormant conflict across the Channel. To Isabella, the prospect was horrifying. She had lived through the human cost of war, not just on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power, where treaties could be torn apart with a signature and children were traded like coin. She feared that her children would grow up amid the same fear and uncertainty that had defined her own childhood. So, from her sickbed, she returned to what she had always done best, diplomacy. Using her unique position as a former Queen of England and now Duchess of Orléans, she opened quiet channels of communication with the English court. Through intermediaries, she urged King Henry IV to stay out of the French civil conflict, warning that intervention would only deepen the suffering on both sides. Her efforts were cautious and mostly unofficial, but they revealed how deeply she understood the dynamics of power, and how committed she remained to peace, even as her own life slipped away. Within France, Isabella's reputation was growing. She was admired not only for her intellect and poise but for her unwavering sense of duty. Even those who distrusted the Orleanist faction admitted that Isabella brought dignity and steadiness to a court under siege. When preliminary peace talks were held between the rival factions in early 1411, Isabella played a quiet but critical role, using her connections, insights, and influence to keep the lines of dialogue open. The talks ultimately failed, but her presence helped prevent the total collapse of negotiations, and many viewed her as one of the few remaining figures capable of bridging the growing divide. But her body could not keep up with her mind. The lingering effects of childbirth had left her vulnerable to infection, and by late 1411, she was often bedridden. She suffered from what we now believe was tuberculosis, a wasting illness the physicians of her time could neither name nor treat. Her breathing became labored, her frame gaunt. Still, she refused to surrender to despair. Each day she rose, dressed, and sat with her children, teaching them, guiding them, holding their hands. She wrote letters to foreign courts, managed estate matters, dictated responses to petitions. She insisted on being useful, even when her strength dwindled to nothing more than a whisper. To those around her, her composure in the face of death became legendary. She made careful plans for her children's futures, chose guardians, and ensured her household would remain intact. She even continued patronizing poets and artists, asking that beauty remain alive in the midst of so much destruction. As the spring of 1412 passed into summer, her condition worsened. She grew thinner, quieter, more reflective. She spent her final weeks in a modest chamber, surrounded by books, tapestries, and the voices of her children. Charles was at her side constantly, his grief written in every movement. He had lost not only a wife, but the one person who truly understood the cost of power. When Isabella of Valois died on September 13, 1412, she was only 20 years old. Yet in those 2 decades, she had been Queen of England, Duchess of Orléans, a wife, a mother, a diplomat, a survivor. Her funeral in Paris drew mourners from across Europe. The procession stretched for miles, a testament to the quiet impact she had left on a continent divided by war. She was laid to rest at the Celestine convent, mourned not as a tragic figure, but as a woman who had lived with purpose, grace, and extraordinary resilience. In the centuries since her death, Isabella of Valois has largely faded from the grand narrative of European history. Overshadowed by louder figures, by kings and conquerors, by queens who reigned longer or ruled more visibly, she became a footnote, remembered, if at all, as the child bride of a deposed English king. But her story deserves far more. Isabella was not merely a pawn, passed between monarchs for the sake of diplomacy. She was a girl who entered the brutal world of royal politics before she was old enough to write her own name, and who managed, against all odds, to retain her dignity, her voice, and her compassion. She lived through 2 kingdoms in crisis, served as a living symbol of peace between warring nations, and navigated the dangerous currents of a court torn apart by ambition and betrayal. She endured exile, widowhood, and war. And yet, at every turn, she refused to become what others expected: passive, broken, forgettable. Instead, she became something else entirely: a quiet force for wisdom, stability, and grace. In a world that often used women as currency, Isabella demanded to be more than a transaction. Her second marriage, unlike her first, was not merely arranged, it was chosen. And in that choice, she found a measure of freedom. She used her position to foster art, education, diplomacy. She gave her children not only noble blood but the tools to navigate the world with empathy and intelligence. She saw clearly the violence and volatility that surrounded her, yet she responded not with cynicism, but with resolve. To modern eyes, her first marriage is shocking: a 6-year-old girl married to a man nearly 5 times her age. And rightly so. But to judge Isabella solely through that lens is to miss the deeper truth. She was born into a world with no place for childhood, where peace was bought with innocence and survival required silence. And yet, she made that world yield, however slightly, to her will. She carved out space where none was given, and in doing so, she changed the lives of those around her. Not through war or conquest, but through intellect, empathy, and strength of character. Her legacy is not inscribed in monuments or national epics. It lives instead in the quieter places, in the manuscripts she commissioned, in the poetry she inspired, in the children she raised, and in the memory of those who saw her not just as a queen, but as a woman of rare integrity. In the end, Isabella's story reminds us that history is not only made by those who wield swords or wear crowns. It is shaped, just as powerfully, by those who endure, who listen, who learn, who lead in quiet defiance of the roles assigned to them. She lived only 20 years. But in that short time, Isabella of Valois gave us something lasting: the example of a girl who became a queen who became a woman, and a woman who never let the world decide who she was meant to be.